Hey guys, welcome back. It's been a while and I'm really anxious to get this video started. Welcome to part 1 of my heart transplant journey. This is the pre-transplant part. Also, I tried to make this video as entertaining as possible since heart transplantation is a serious subject. And I don't want to put my audience to sleep either. One last thing before we start, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. This is a picture that I took 2 years ago. It's of a place called Stump. It's on the Gulf of Mexico near the southern part of Manasota Key. If you're ever in the area, I highly recommend checking it out. Now finally, back to the transplant journey. I figured the best way to do this is I'll ask a question and then I'll answer it. First question is, did I know that there was something wrong with me? Yes, I did. I had a terrible cold, which I thought at the time was the flu, and just didn't seem to go away. This all happened when I was 23 years old, and I was at the University of South Florida in Tampa. Next question, what were your symptoms? My symptoms were a persistent cough, shortness of breath, racing heart. My pulse was somewhere between 90 and 120 beats a minute resting, so quite high. And also I had a lot of fluid retention. These are all symptoms of congestive heart failure, and that's what I was experiencing at the time. And I thought I just had a regular cold, but obviously I didn't. So what did I do? I went to the emergency room and I was admitted, and they did a bunch of tests and things like that. An EKG, right and left heart cath. I was diagnosed with a cardiomyopathy. So what happened was the left side of my heart became enlarged. When that happens, your heart can no longer pump properly. I recall having a racing pulse, which is due to the heart trying to compensate for extremely low blood pressure, or basically non-existent blood pressure, I might add. I remember going in for my checkups and looking at the echocardiogram. You could clearly see that my valves were spread apart and they could not close properly. You could also see in the echocardiogram that the blood would essentially just pool inside the heart. That's because there was such a large gap between the valves. My heart was also so enlarged that you could see it beating against my chest. It looked like my shirt was moving where it was beating. Pretty freaky stuff. So then what did I do after I was diagnosed with a cardiomyopathy? Well, I got together with my cardiologist and we looked for a transplant center. But before I could be listed at a transplant center, I had to go for a transplant evaluation. I recall that the transplant centers first wanted to make sure that you were a good candidate for a heart transplant. There was a whole bunch of criteria that I had to meet. Essentially, I remember it something like you had to be otherwise healthy minus your cardiac issues. Seems odd that they want you to be healthy when here you are with serious cardiac issues. It seemed like they had to do a million different tests, a ton of blood work, heart catheterizations, breathing tests. You know those ones where they put something like a clothespin on your nose and then ask you to breathe out? Not easy. I was, however, lucky enough to get out of one of the tests. It was one of those stress tests where you have to run on a treadmill and you have a mask hooked up to you with a whole bunch of hoses. It definitely would not have worked out for me, simply because of the fact that I could barely even stand. So that was definitely a no-go. After I was approved for a heart transplant, then I was put on a transplant waiting list. I recall they had a whole bunch of different waiting statuses. I also would like to add that I was listed at 3 different transplant centers, and actually the last one there, Tampa General, is where I had my heart transplant. The next question is, where did I wait? I was lucky enough that I was able to wait at home. I have absolutely no idea what I would have done if I had to wait in the hospital. I just don't know what I would have done. Probably would have gone crazy. Since I was waiting at home, that was called a status 2. That's also because I was not hooked up to any life support, or I was not requiring any IV medication. I did, however, have to go to the hospital from time to time. That was for something that they would call a tune-up. And no, I wasn't bringing my car in. What would happen is, after a certain time period, my heart would become weaker and I would have to go into the hospital, and they would give you a medication called dobutamine, which would help strengthen your heart and increase the pumping function. And dobutamine is administered in the hospital, so I would have to go in for a couple of days and be on the dobutamine intravenously. Then they would discharge me, and I would go for about, on average, about 3 to 4 months before I needed to go back in and get another tune-up. And that was an occurring thing all the way up until the point that I got the call for my transplant. Which leads me to the next question. The question is, how did the hospital contact me when an organ became available? At the time, there were two ways, since this was before cell phones. The first way is just a regular telephone call, and the other way they would contact you is via a beeper. So I wore one of those when I would go anywhere. But because of my condition, I rarely left to go anywhere other than to a checkup or the hospital. I'm trying to think if there's anything I forgot to mention. So now the question is, how long did I wait? Let's see, if I can remember correctly, I waited, I think it was about 8 months after I was listed at Tampa General. And then on December 8th of 1996, at about 12:30 a.m., the phone rang, and it was Tampa General calling to tell me to get my stuff ready, and they have a heart for me. Here are some pictures of me pre-transplant taken back in the day that I'd like to share with you. As you can tell, I was extremely pale and very thin. I remember I felt like I had no energy all the time, and basically all I felt like doing was sleeping. I was also very dizzy, especially when I tried to stand up, since my blood pressure was very low. When your heart doesn't work, not much else does. If you look in the picture on the left-hand side there, I'm sure you'll notice that I'm wearing a beeper. So whenever I would leave the house, I would bring that with me. That was back in the day before iPhones and all the stuff we have now. Anyways, I eventually had to use a wheelchair as my condition worsened. Thank God a heart became available when it did. I was at the point where I was sick of being sick. I couldn't wait for my transplant and to start feeling better. Hopefully you enjoyed the pictures. That reminds me, I have a story. It's about eating. And as you know, digestion takes a lot of energy. Now add to that a heart that doesn't work. Every time I'd try to eat something, I'd feel terribly ill and drained. There were not a whole lot of foods that I could eat. And now you're not going to believe this. I could eat Chinese food. Go figure. It was at that time that I was listed at the Cleveland Clinic, and because of that I had to be within a certain distance of the hospital. So in order to do that, I had to move to New York to live with my dad. Now getting back to the story. Since I could only eat Chinese food, I had my dad order takeout when he came home from work. I would order a vegetarian egg roll, either mushu pork or sesame chicken. How strange for somebody who could not eat anything else at all. It's funny, I probably haven't had Chinese food in like 20 years. So now you're probably wondering, how in the world did I end up at Tampa General Hospital? Well, in December 1995, I flew home to Sarasota, Florida to spend Christmas with my mom. I remember I barely made it to Sarasota, and actually the next day I ended up in Sarasota Memorial Hospital. They put me on some dobutamine to get me feeling a bit better. I believe I was in the hospital, if I remember correctly, for about a week and a half. It was also at that time that I figured it would be pretty much impossible for me to make the trip back to New York. So while I was in the hospital, I called the Cleveland Clinic to let them know what was going on. And I also asked them if there were any transplant centers in Florida that they knew of or anything else close by. So they got back to me within a couple hours and they said that Tampa General was a really good transplant center. So who knew there was a transplant center only an hour away? So we called Tampa General and made an appointment for an evaluation, and the rest is history. I also recorded some video of going to Tampa General. So just for a moment, picture that it's 1996 and it's at night, and you just got a phone call from Tampa General, and you're going to the hospital to get your heart. Well, that's it for now. Please email me if you have any questions, and be sure to click the like button, and please subscribe to my channel. See you next time.